Hi class, in this video we'll be talking about changing the data layout with pivot functions. If you're following along in the demo file, you should make sure to run your options, your libraries, and load the data. First, I'm going to talk about pivot longer. And we will jump right into the example from the tutorial. So we would like to change the US average tuition data so that year and average tuition are columns in the data set. So let's open this data set first so we can see what it looks like. So we can see here, let me try to make this bigger. We can see that the columns names are years. And inside of here are the average tuitions. So this might be a nice way to look at the data if this is a final summary. But if we want to try to analyze the data further, we would like year to be a variable and tuition to be a single variable. So we are going to put in the US average tuition data, and then we're going to use the pivot longer function. So remember, the pivot longer function is going to make our data set longer. There will be more rows than there were before, and there will be fewer columns than there were before, so it'll be narrower. And something I usually do when I'm using these pivot functions is I search for them over here in the help, because for some reason I forget the names of the arguments. And I'm going to open this up bigger. So the arguments I need to give it are cols, which are the columns to pivot into a longer format, the names to, and then the values to. So cols, which columns do we want to pivot? Those would be our year columns. So I'm going to use one of our helper functions, starts with, and grab all the variables that start with 20. That's a really nice way to do it in this case because that covers all of the variables that we want. And actually, I'm going to change my mind. That's how I did it in the example in the tutorial. Instead, this time, I'm going to choose everything except state. So I can do that by doing cols equal minus state. So that will be everything except state. Now I need to give it the names that I want these current column names to go to. So I'm going to tell it that the names should go to year. In this case, this needs to be in quotes. And then we need to give it the values to argument. So this is where my average tuition values are going to go, also in quotes. So I'm going to call that average tuition and spell it correctly. And when we run that code, we now see that we have a column for year, a column for average tuition. We still have a column for state. So this is a lot longer than it was before. And later in the course, you'll actually learn some cool things you could do to actually, not much later, very soon, you'll learn some cool things you can do to sort of extract these years separately. Okay. And moving on. So that's sort of a typical example of pivot longer. Another use for pivot longer is when I want to create the same type of graph for different variables. So for example, if I want to make a histogram for each of the body measurements in the penguins data, and let's just take a quick peek at the penguins data. There it is. So what I mean is I want to make I think there's 4 of them. Bill length, bill depth, flipper length, and body mass are the 4 different measurements for which I'd like to make histograms. I could do this by hand and make 4 separate histograms, but instead, I'm going to use the pivot longer function with facet wrap. So first, let's create the long data. So here we'll take penguins and pivot longer. And the columns that we want to turn into, that are currently the column names that we want to turn into one column, are all of these body measurements. So they go from bill length millimeters through body mass grams. So I'm going to use this little trick, bill length millimeters through, body mass grams. Those are the columns that I want to now turn into one column. I want those names to go to a variable that I'm going to call measurements. And I want the values to go to a variable, I'm just going to call it values. So let's run that and make sure I didn't make a mistake. I think that turned out okay. So now we see this new variable called measurement, which has the 4 different variable names in it and their values. Now, if I wanted to keep analyzing the data, this would be this would not be a nice way or a nice form to have the data in, right? Because now these values I can't really do anything with because they're a mixture of different measurements. But if I want to make a plot, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste this code. If I want a histogram for each measurement, I can now do that really easily with some faceting. So here's my pivoted data. I will pipe that into ggplot. And on the axis static, I am going to put the values. And then I'm going to add my histogram. And then I am going to facet by measurement. Oops. Is that what I called it? Measurements. Okay. So I'm probably going to have to edit this a bit. Okay, so one thing we see here is that this one looks pretty clear, body mass, but flipper length, bill length, and bill depth don't. And that's because these are much smaller units. So one thing we might want to do is add an argument called scales. And I'm actually going to let both the X and Y axis be free, meaning they can all have their own axes. So there we can see the distributions of all 4 of these variables. So a nice little pivot longer plus facet wrap trick. If you've taken my machine learning course, you've seen this trick before. Okay, moving on to pivot wider. Let's go through the example from the tutorial. So first, I created the penguins fake data set by using the pivot longer function we just talked about. I'm not going to walk through this again. You're welcome to look later. But here's that fake long data set I had created. Now, this time I did also add observation because this is going to be important when we want to change this back to a long data set. If I didn't have observation, I would have a bit of a problem because it's possible that species, island, sex, and year do not uniquely identify an observation. Actually, it's very common that that happens. All right, so let's use pivot wider to change it back to what the original penguins data set looked like, right? So now we want to put these 4 different measurements back into their own variables. So we'll take the penguins fake data and we will pivot wider. And when you do this, you can actually see the names of the arguments in here. So I'm not going to go to the help right now, but you should do that if you need to. We have the ID columns. These are the columns that uniquely identify each row. So again, if we didn't have that observation in there, we actually wouldn't have a variable that uniquely identifies each row. So we can again use our select helper functions. I'm just going to choose species through observation, and I'm going to use that colon, which means through. So species colon obs. These are the variables that uniquely identify each row. And then here, the arguments I'm giving it are names from. So in pivot longer, you give it names to. In pivot wider, you give it names from, because this is the column from which you're going to get the new column name. So for us, that's called measurement. And this is not in quotes. And then we also need to tell it, oops, the column that the values are from. And in this case, it's called value. Again, not in quotes. Okay, so when we do that, we see that we now get bill length, bill depth, flipper length, and body mass back up as their own columns. Okay, another use for pivot wider. So here I've summarized my garden harvest data. I've chosen tomatoes, peas, beans, and lettuce, and found the total weight harvested on each day of the week. Okay, so let's run that. This table is sort of long to look through, right? It's 28 rows. I can't, you know, I can't see all the values in one spot, even if I had a big page open. So for looking at these results, I'd rather have a column for each vegetable. Keep in mind, this is just for viewing the results. I'm assuming I won't be doing further analysis. If I want to keep playing with the data, it's better to leave it in its current form. But let's say I sort of want this final nice looking view of the data. So I am once again going to copy and paste this code. Oops. So I'll copy that and paste it here. So we are going to pivot wider. And I am going to skip the ID columns for now. So if we don't give it the ID columns, the assumption that it's everything is that it's everything that's not in our names from and values from arguments. So I'll just skip that for now. So in this case, the names are going to be from vegetable. So this will create a new column for each vegetable. And our values are from, let's see, what did I call that? Total weight, oops. Total weight. So here we can now see these results in one table very clearly. So nice little summary of the data, or a nice table to summarize our data. So again, this is no longer tidy data, but it's a much nicer way to look at the summarized data. Later in the course, fairly soon, we will talk about ways we can make this table look even nicer. All right, thanks for listening. I will see you soon.